Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another installment of our video PowerPoint series for Unit 5, Cell Energistics. Today, what we're going to be talking about is cellular respiration. So in this video, what you can expect to see is what cellular respiration is, as well as the steps that go through it. What we're also going to discuss are things like aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration, also known as fermentation. So, let's go ahead and work our way through this, shall we? I will see you all on the next slide. So, respiration. Simply put, respiration is the biochemical process that makes ATP from glucose, or sugar. This occurs in both autotrophs and heterotrophs. That's right, so this occurs in both plants, or shrubbery, as well as animals. For example, like the cheetah we have down here. By the way, you can tell it's a cheetah because cheetahs always look like they're crying. The more you know. So respiration occurs in both autotrophs and heterotrophs, specifically because of one organelle they both share, which is the mitochondria. So respiration. There are two main types of respiration. We have aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic requires oxygen to release energy. So aerobic, think about it. You're going ahead, you're doing aerobics, moving around a lot, you got your yoga, all that fun stuff. They always tell you to breathe. So aerobic needs oxygen. The other type is anaerobic, which we'll talk about in a bit. So the chemical equation for aerobic respiration is as follows. We have C6H12O6, which if you remember from last time is glucose, as well as 6 molecules of oxygen. From here, our products are 6 molecules of H2O, 6 molecules of CO2, and a net gain of 36 molecules of ATP. So we're getting a pretty big amount of energy from this glucose. How do we do this? Well, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide and find out. Yeah, so like I said down there, glucose, oxygen, gives us water, CO2, and energy. Gets me every time. So respiration. Anaerobic respiration does not require oxygen. We also call this fermentation. So fermentation can actually be used to create a wide variety of different substances that we use today. These include things like wine and alcohol, cheese, as well as bread. So both aerobic and anaerobic respiration begin with the first step, or the same process, known as glycolysis. So let's go ahead and figure out what exactly this means. Although if you break apart the name, glycolysis, I'm pretty sure you can figure it out. So glycolysis. This occurs inside of the cytoplasm, or the jello-like substance that keeps everything inside the cell. It literally means to split the sugar. So glyco meaning sugar, and lysis meaning to split or to break. So the chemical equation for glycolysis, the first step, is as follows. So we take our C6H12O6, or our glucose, and we go ahead and use 2 molecules of ATP to break it apart. Now when we break the glucose, what we create are 2 molecules of something called pyruvic acid, also known as pyruvate. And we get 4 ATP out of the deal, because we broke a set of bonds. So if we put 2 in and got 4 out, now I'm not much of a mathematician here, but I'm fairly certain that gives us a net gain of 2. So glycolysis, the steps for this. Step number 1. The glucose molecules are broken down into 2 molecules of pyruvic acid, also known as pyruvate. Now, to do this, 2 ATP molecules are used, and 4 ATP molecules are created, resulting in a net gain of 2 ATP. So you put 2 in, you get 4 out, you have a net gain of 2. Step number 3. Following glycolysis, the pyruvic acid can follow one of 2 paths. It can either go through aerobic respiration, if there's oxygen, or anaerobic respiration, if there's none. Whew, speaking of aerobic respiration, I gotta learn to breathe here. I'm talking way too fast. Give me a sec. Every time that tea hits a spot. So if you wouldn't mind going ahead and sketching this up, what we're doing here is creating a diagram that we're going to repeatedly come back to to document the steps of aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration, also known as, well, I guess the overlying title would be cell respiration. So glycolysis, our first step, we start off with glucose, and it goes through glycolysis, giving us a net gain of 2 ATP as well as 2 molecules of pyruvic acid, or pyruvate. Now from here, the pyruvate can go through one of two steps, like we said, either through aerobic or through anaerobic. So let's find out what happens when we go through aerobic, shall we? So aerobic respiration occurs inside the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. So step number 1. Now there's 5 steps here, so bear with me, hang in there, I know you can make it through. So the pyruvic acid molecules are converted into something called acetyl-CoA, or acetyl coenzyme A. The acetyl-CoA is broken down into hydrogen, CO2, and ATP. So this is called the Krebs Cycle, not to be mistaken with the Krebs Cycle. That's something completely different that I don't quite think exists yet. Anyway, so this is where the CO2 is created and also released back into the atmosphere. Much like when you talk or breathe or, well, do anything, CO2 is coming out of your face. And this is where it comes from. Step number 3, the hydrogen ions bond to carrier molecules, called NAD+ and FAD. When the hydrogen bonds to these, we go from NAD to NADH, and FAD to FADH2. So we technically go from NAD and FAD to NAD-HA and FAD-HA. Now these two energy carriers are going to be used up later when we go through the electron transport chain. So step number 4, NADH and FADH2 go through a series of step reactions called the electron transport chain to produce our ATP. Much like this, so we have NADH going through the electron transport, kicking out some hydrogen, and carrying a lot of electrons towards the end. We trade these electrons in to get our payoff of ATP. So each cycle produces 10 NADH molecules, 2 FADH2 molecules, and 2 molecules of ATP, which, if you think back, came from glycolysis. Now this is where we get the payoff, all right? This is the big money. Big money. So we get, for every 1 NADH molecule, we get 3 ATP. So if you go ahead and do the math, we have 10 NADH molecules, each one gives us 3 ATP. 10 times 3, that gives us 30. For every FADH2 molecule we have, that gives us 2 ATP. So, since we have 2 FADH2 molecules, and we get 2 ATP for each, that's going to give us 4 ATP. So if we combine all of this, the end product of aerobic respiration is the production of 36 molecules of ATP. Pretty good deal in my opinion. So go ahead, copy this down, and we're going to move back to our diagram. So after glycolysis, our next step that releases CO2 is called the Krebs Cycle. So the Krebs Cycle, if you think back, this is where the acetyl coenzyme A is broken down, we release the CO2. This is also where the hydrogen bonds to NAD and FAD to make NADH and FADH2. So, our energy carrier molecules go through the electron transport chain and kick out 36 molecules of ATP. And also, we get some H2O out of that in the form of sweat. So, anaerobic respiration is what we're going to be speaking about next. Thank you. So, anaerobic respiration. This occurs inside the cytoplasm of the cell. This occurs in the absence of oxygen. So, we go ahead, split up the glucose, we go through the anaerobic respiration, and instead of getting this real nice payoff, well, we get something else entirely. So we go through either A, lactic acid fermentation, or B, alcoholic fermentation. So lactic acid fermentation converts pyruvic acid into lactic acid and CO2. So we don't really go through any of the major steps here that we got the big payoff for in aerobic. So the lactic acid that's created in these reactions can build up in muscles when they run out of oxygen. And this is what causes muscle soreness. So think about it. You go ahead, you go for a run, you start off feeling great. Then over time, your muscles gradually start to go ahead and get sore. What's happening is you're having a buildup of lactic acid. Now, if this isn't taken care of, if you don't stop, eventually your body will, make you stop. Think about marathons. When somebody goes ahead and actually crosses the finish line, a lot of them just go ahead and collapse. That's basically their body saying, dude, I've got way too much lactic acid right now. I need a break. The second type is called alcoholic fermentation. This converts pyruvic acid into ethanol and CO2. This is the process used to make things like wine, beer, cheese, and bread. Now, let's go ahead and just get this straight, shall we? Lactic acid fermentation occurs mostly in animal cells, whereas alcoholic fermentation occurs in plants and microorganisms, so things like yeast, also fruit. So basically what I'm trying to get across here is the human body does not go through alcoholic fermentation. If so, can you imagine that? Can you imagine marathons at that point? Everything would start off fine, but by the time they get to about the 5-10 mile marker, people would be dropping like flies, man. So anyway, both processes result in the production of only 2 ATP. So instead of getting this real nice payoff that we got from aerobic, we only get 2. That's another reason why the body eventually stops working. It's like, dude, I'm not getting enough energy. I'm not getting enough. I can't keep this going. So factors affecting cell respiration are pretty straightforward. Pretty much the only thing affecting cell respiration is the ATP concentration. The more ATP available, the slower the rate. Which makes sense because if your body already has a buildup of ATP, it doesn't have to go through and create a bunch to keep you going. So let's go ahead and fill in the rest of our chart. So without oxygen, we go through anaerobic respiration, which is fermentation. And we eventually get alcohol or lactic acid, and we also have 2 ATP, which if you go ahead and think back, where'd that 2 ATP come from? Boom. Right there, glycolysis. So, aerobic 36, anaerobic 2. Well, that's just going to go ahead and finish it up for today, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us when we were talking about cell respiration here. So, in summary, in conclusion, what we talked about today was where cell respiration takes place, so primarily inside the cytoplasm and the mitochondria. We also talked about the process of cell respiration. So we start off with glycolysis. Well, technically we start off with the glucose. Go through glycolysis. From glycolysis we can go one of 2 ways. Aerobic if we have oxygen, or anaerobic if we don't. From aerobic we can go from glycolysis to the Krebs cycle, to the electron transport, and the net gain of ATP that we get at the end is 36 molecules. Meanwhile, if we go ahead and go to anaerobic, what we end up getting instead are only 2 molecules of ATP, as well as either lactic acid from fermentation, or alcohol, also from fermentation. So that's just about going to go ahead and do it. This also is the last note section for this unit. So, what that means is I will see you all in the next video, primarily in the next unit. So until then, you all keep it classy. Take care.